Hello and welcome. I am Captain Tom and I will be your host today. Welcome aboard the Silverwind. I am joined by my co-host, producer, and intergalactic robot Wilson. And today we are going to go to the object that Wilson almost ran into last time. And I'm pretty sure I pronounced it incorrectly last time. I think I said Calypso. It is Callisto. That's the name of the moon. And we have some facts for it. So let's go ahead and let's get over there. So let's see here. There we go. And listen, you gonna hit it? Hold up. We got it right here. And all right, there we go. So we are going to Callisto. I have several facts for you about this place, and the first one is and you're going to see this, it's the most cratered object in our solar system. So if you thought the moon had a bunch of craters on it, wait till you see this. It is also the second largest moon of Jupiter and the third largest moon in our solar system. It's actually close to the size, about 99% of the size of Mercury. So it's actually a pretty cool place. Let's see here. There we are. So let me make sure that we are locked in and good to go. Okay, Wilson, no shenanigans this time? You didn't forget anything at Earth, did you? Okay, all right. I think we're good. Okay, so some other interesting facts about this. Got a few things written down for you guys. It is so it's about 60% rock and about 40% ice. That's the best estimation of it. And so these lighter spots that you see here with these massive craters, those are the spots where I guess they're more recent cratering, and it's basically ice, right? And then the rest of it is where the ice has kind of gotten a lot more I guess dirty. So anyways, it's mainly kind of a water ocean. I wouldn't want to call it a planet. Planets revolve around the sun, but it's like an ocean moon almost, and it is frozen because it's about negative 208 degrees Fahrenheit, and in Celsius that is negative 139 degrees. So it is very much frozen. But one of the interesting things that that NASA and stuff has found out about this place is that it looks like it has an underground ocean, a saltwater ocean, which is obviously frozen by now, but also meant that at some point in time, it was warm for an ocean to be able to form. So big question is, how did it get to, how did it get to the way it is right now? So before we go on more about Callisto, I do want to acknowledge you guys here. So this guy, welcome. Julian, nice to see you. Lisa, yes, chapter 5, let's go. And then, make sure your brakes work. Yes, of course. And then, of course, hi, Wilson. Oh, and Captain Tom. Yes. You can't forget Captain Tom. And you know what? Wilson deserves credit where credit is due. All right. So he does a lot around here. He does maintenance on the life support systems, and which we both need, right, Wilson? Yes, I have convinced him of this, so please, don't ruin a good thing. So anyways, that gets maintenance first, and he takes care of that, and that is a good thing. So let's see here. Yes, so there's a bit of a mystery about Callisto, and this is a little bit of what I want to talk about. So last week, we brought up some stuff with Jupiter. That's Jupiter in the background over there. And Jupiter has these bands and zones, and these bands and zones are different temperatures, but more importantly than that, they are different gases. And so the idea about Jupiter is that it's about 4.5 billion years old. That's what most modern day scientists estimate it to be at. The idea is that maybe there was a rock or just a cloud of gas that condensed, by gravity eventually, somewhere out on the edge of our solar system or outside of it, drifted in towards the sun, and then got caught into an orbit. And so that had to have happened like a really, really long time ago. And this moon in particular would be about 4 billion years old, as most objects that would be revolving around it would have to be also very, very old. So you have, Callisto is very much old, cold, and dead. And that it does call into question a little bit the whole aspect of the ocean. At what point in time could there have been a warm ocean on Callisto? It had to be warm enough for there to be some kind of liquid water on the surface of it. And Well, we have the same question when it comes to Jupiter, because Jupiter has all these different bands. They're flowing in opposite directions to one another, right? So these different bands you see, they're not all flowing in the same direction. They're flowing in opposite directions, which is really odd. I mean, how does gas condense around something and stay separated in streams flowing against one another? It's very weird. I would love to see the models that show how that formed, because it doesn't really work out logically, right? And in addition to that, you can actually see in the edges of these bands with Jupiter, it looks like they're mixing. And this was kind of the gripe I brought up last week. Is like, are you telling me that these things, that looks like these gases are mixing, they're flowing in opposite directions against one another, and they haven't mixed in 4.5 billion years? Honestly, that's a big ask for me to believe. So, maybe it's true. Maybe there's someone who's an expert on Jupiter's climate and atmosphere who's got all the models worked out. But just telling me that on its face, honestly, that's a big ask to believe in. That's a lot of blind faith to believe those gases wouldn't have mixed by now. And then also for Callisto to ever have a warm ocean, so the distance it is from Jupiter, it's not able to get any heat from the friction of the gravitational field, or really the magnetic field of Jupiter. So some of the other moons have a different, they're more active. They're also a bit closer to Jupiter. But with Callisto, that's not the case. So Callisto at one point in time had to be pretty close to Jupiter and in some kind of rotation around it to be warm, and then somehow got all the way out here, and yet now it's in a consistent revolution around Jupiter at that distance. So it's a little bit odd to believe that maybe it was moving away at a rate, and maybe best excuse I could see was there was an asteroid hit it and knocked it, prevented it from leaving Jupiter anymore. It's a very weird situation. Now, there's all kinds of these interesting mysteries that we find out here in space, especially when you take it purely from a materialist worldview. When you take it from a creation or theistic worldview, it actually isn't very hard to explain. People who believe that, the story that we're reading today, or any kind of theology, it's a very easy explanation. These things were created to be incredible, different, unique, and beautiful. And as we can see, we got two very unique and beautiful celestial bodies out here in the solar system. And it's like almost no further explanation needed. So anyways, it's just something to ponder. So fun stuff. Let's go ahead and talk about the story. And before we do that, we're going to go ahead and go back to the reading room, which means you got to turn the ship around, and that's going to take just a few seconds, less than a minute, right? So we'll move pretty fast to do that. And in the process, we'll just go ahead and hit that transition. So we'll see you in just a few seconds. Right, well, Wilson, just hit it. All right, so here we go. Beautiful scene behind us. So yes, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what we're going to get into with chapter 5 of the Bible. Now, this is some would say this is a bit of a lull in the story. So basically, most of what we're going to be reading today is a genealogy, but there are things to understand about the story or learn about the story with this, and I think it would be a disservice to do a channel like this, say that we're going to go through the Bible, and then just skip things that we thought were boring, because come on, it wouldn't be here if it wasn't important. So there are some things I want to point out before we start reading. We actually just got done covering the story of the fall with Adam and Eve. We covered the events of Cain and Abel, how Cain killed his brother out of jealousy or whatever the case was. He was not happy that God wasn't accepting his gift, and so he killed his brother out of spite. And then we see Cain's line a little bit, and we see that it basically resulted in a king who was bragging about doing really depraved things and disregard God entirely, even almost mocking God by claiming that God would protect him even more than Cain was protected because he was doing even more evil things, which is clearly like a misunderstanding of God, right? Which I'm sure he understood that. So anyways, so we see a degrading of morality down Cain's line. So now we're going to actually go into Seth's line, and Seth is the third son that's born, and we'll get to see what happens with this. And this actually does set up quite nicely the next chapter when we get into essentially what the world is looking like in this really early stage. And so on the subject of genealogies, I have some notes right here I want to share with you guys. So biblical genealogies aren't always complete, right? The purpose of a genealogy is just to show where a group came from and just trying to cover the highlights or what's important between that gap of people. So sometimes things are left out intentionally, right? You know, they're trying to save space. They don't want to write anything down that doesn't need to be written down. And we don't know if there's any omissions in this genealogy, but just keep that in mind. It is important. So if one were to take the genealogies and say that there were no omissions in the genealogies from Adam all the way to Noah, right? And then we have the genealogies from Noah to Abraham. And it gives us an idea, like we kind of know when Abraham was alive. And so it gives us an idea of how old of a picture that the Bible is saying the earth is. And so it would be somewhere about, as old as 5,000 BC or even about 10,000 BC if there were omissions, right? So that's kind of, between, what would that be? About 7 to 12,000 years old is about as much as the Bible is given us there, which does put the Bible very much at odds with modern day accepted science, and or at least the scientific community. So we have to talk about what we're talking about with science, right? But one of the things about that is that if you were to say, so a lot of things look like they're really old. We've got light to get to Earth from the nearest star would take, it's millions of light years away, which means it would take millions of years for that particle light to get here. But one of the advantages that the theist has is that Adam was created as an adult. All the trees in the garden were created as fully grown trees. And so things were created with apparent age. You would take a tree that God created on day one. If you cut it in half, it would have a bunch of rings inside of it. So there were things created with apparent age because they needed to be at apparent age to be useful, right? At creation. Well, the same thing could be said about the stars and things like that. I mean, why would God create stars on day one, and then even though he has the power to create the light in between, he just sits around and waits for it to get to Earth? It's if someone says, well, their evidence against the Bible is that there are all these fantastic things in here and everything looks old in the universe. Well, that's a argument that's begging the question. Begging the question is a argumentative fallacy that basically assumes the conclusion of what you're arguing, right? So to say that, the Bible, and we also have another fantastic thing in here. People are living to be hundreds of years old. You're going to see that in the text here. We're talking like 800, 900 years old. And it's like, there's no way a person can live to be 900 years old. Well, these things that seem like a bit larger than life and that sort of thing, these would be, not difficult at all for an all-powerful God, right? So if you're begging the question and assuming that God doesn't exist at all, then you're saying, well, these things couldn't have happened in the Bible because God doesn't exist. Well, if God does exist, then these things obviously could happen, right? They're not impossible at all. So anyways, just making sure that if you are arguing against it, and that's totally fine if you are, just make sure you're not using that fallacy where you're begging the question, because that's not gonna help you in a debate against someone who knows what they're talking about, right? So you don't want to look silly. So we've got the age. I brought up that. And we also have to consider this with these very long ages of these people in the Bible. They have, or at least at this period of time, we call it pre-flood. So one of the things about that is that Adam had a perfect body. Adam and Eve, right? They had a perfect body. There were no mistakes in it. There was nothing at all, that was degrading whatsoever. So the whole process of degradation and entropy started when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, right? They couldn't eat from the tree of life anymore, and they were now disconnected from God spiritually in a way that their bodies would die. Very much like a leaf stays green on a tree, generally, or at least as opposed to when you take it off the tree, right? So if you pull a leaf off of a tree, it's disconnected from its source of life, and even though it doesn't die immediately, it does begin to die, and it will eventually turn brown and crumple up and turn to dust, right? So that's kind of what's happening with people in this situation. And that means Adam and Eve, who had perfect bodies, are now degrading from that perfect state. And so it's very reasonable to believe, if those set of facts are true, that you would have people living to be hundreds and hundreds of years. And it would also create a very interesting situation when it comes to population. So I found this little nugget of math, which is really fun. So basically, if you were to calculate if Adam only had about half the kids he could have had living as old as he lives, and half of his children had half the kids they could have had living as old as they lived, well, then he could have seen well over, I think it's 7 million of his own descendants, right? In his own lifetime, which means that the overall potential population of the world before, at least in these early days, could have been in the billions. Like the human population would have exploded very, very quickly under these circumstances. So interesting picture that creates, just fun stuff I want to give you guys before we start reading here, just so you have the mindset of the picture that's being created by all these little fun details. So and I think that's so the calculation is as old as 7 billion, but of course that's not taking into account things like war, famine, disease, all these things that would be happening now. We know that those types of things reduce a population. So probably wasn't at 7 billion, but could have been a lot of people regardless. All right, with that, let's go ahead and just go right into the story here. So we're all caught up on chats. So yeah, you know what, Wilson, let's go to some different views right here. How about this one? All right. This is the written account of the descendants of Adam. When God created human beings, he made them to be like himself. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and called them humans. I just want to make a quick note on that. Like that's worthy of acknowledging that repetition. When things are repeated in any piece of literature, it's because it's important, right? And it's important to understand that set of facts right there. Created the male and female, called them human, so we've got and made them to be like himself, right? And that's in character. And I think that's pretty easy to see, in the way that human beings operate. We're very creative. We're capable of a lot of good, and yet there's something wrong, and we all know what that wrong thing is. It's all the evil in the world. A lot of it comes from us. So let's go ahead and go into the next set of verses here and get a better picture of this story. When Adam was 130 years old, he became the father of a son who was just like him, in his very image. He named his son Seth. After the birth of Seth, Adam lived another 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Adam lived 930 years, and then he died. When Seth was 105 years old, he became the father of Enosh. After the birth of Enosh, Seth lived another 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Seth lived 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh was 90 years old, he became the father of Kenan. After the birth of Kenan, Enosh lived another 815 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Enosh lived 905 years, and then he died. When Kenan was 70 years old, he became the father of Mahalalel. After the birth of Mahalalel, Kenan lived another 840 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Kenan lived 910 years, and then he died. So, speaking of repetition, we have a lot of repetition here when we go to, it keeps on talking about, of course, how old they were when they had a prominent, son. This wasn't necessarily their first son, but just a prominent one in this genealogy. And at the end of each one, it's saying how they died. It's that could have been assumed, right? But the text here is intentionally repeating that, because what was the consequence of Adam and Eve's sin? It was death. And we see the fruition of what God promised was going to happen happening here to human beings, right? Which we're all too familiar with, but that repetition is like, oh yeah, and here's the consequence of that sin. Here's that consequence again. Doesn't matter who it is, with one exception. So we're going to get to this really interesting part in this genealogy, which is going to be, worthwhile to stop and talk about a little bit. So let's go ahead and get to that part. Oh, real quick. So nice question here. This guy, Seth was born in his image. Does that mean Cain and Abel were not? So it doesn't necessarily mean. So I think what it means in that is, So Cain was obviously, out of character with Adam. Now, the stuff we have seen close up to Adam, it seems like, Adam was pretty nasty in some of the things that he did and some of his perspective, but it seems like he, may have gone legit after that, may have learned his lesson. And so in his own image, so kind of means like, this is someone who, listened to him, took up his same kind of characteristics and mannerisms, similar to how humans were created in God's image to be like him. And so we have Seth, who is like Adam in the sense that, he was a good boy, right? Very similar to Abel. And I think the same could have been said about Abel and how he was, worshiped God and followed what he was supposed to follow and do. And so, so Cain, I think that's in stark contrast, because after we just talked about Cain in the previous chapter, it's like, and this one is different from Cain. So I think that's probably the most important part of this in the literature, is just to set Seth apart from Cain, because what we get from Cain's character is that, a bunch of bad dudes came from Cain. Now Seth, different from Cain, he is in Adam's character. Does that make sense? So that's the, at least that fits the narrative. So I think that's what it means in that. Or maybe he just looked very much like Adam, So anyways, let's keep going through it. All right. When Mahalalel was 65 years old, he became the father of Jared. Oh, there's a regular sounding name. After the birth of Jared, Mahalalel lived another 830 years. And he had other sons and daughters. Mahalalel lived 895 years, and then he died. When Jared was 162 years old, he became the father of Enoch. After the birth of Enoch, Jared lived another 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Jared lived 962 years, and then he died. Now, this guy's important. When Enoch was 65 years old, he became the father of Methuselah. After the birth of Methuselah, Enoch lived in close fellowship with God for another 300 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Enoch lived 365 years, walking in close fellowship with God. Then, one day, he disappeared because God took him. Now that is wild. So we have the first of two people in the entire story of the Bible who don't die, right? So it's very interesting that we have in this little block of narrative here, it's like, here's a repetition, and this guy died, and this guy died. Hey, remember what happened in the garden? Remember the punishment for sin? And then there's just this one guy who stands apart. And why does he stand apart? It says that he walked in close fellowship with God for 300 years. So not his whole life, but after, this particular son that he had. It's not that that was his first kid, but it's this particular son, something changed in his life, and he walks very closely with God. Now, there is another place in the Bible that references Enoch, and it's in Joel. I want to make sure I've got that correct. Let's see here. Let's see. Oh, maybe I wrote it down. Should have written it down. Yes, it's one of the minor prophets, and in that it references how Enoch was a prophet and how he basically spoke in defense of God, and saying that evil would be punished, which means that even at this time there's a lot of evil going on in the world. And Enoch was kind of like God's prophet in those times, telling people to turn away from the sin and turn back to God. We don't get all those details in the narrative at this point, but that's just some information that we can point to because it's brought up later in the story. So it's very interesting. We've got him. Elijah's the next one, who is also a prophet, walked closely with God, and it almost seems like God was willing to make an exception to the death penalty, essentially, for those who, as I said, walked really closely with him. So pretty interesting stuff. God's ways obviously wouldn't be our ways of things, so sometimes maybe a little difficult to understand why he makes some of the decisions that he makes. But there's some interesting stuff around this Enoch character. So the first, there's these books of Enoch, and one was in I want to make sure I say it correctly, the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the historical findings of Old Testament documents written in BC, right? So they were, in a cave around the Dead Sea, and they're dated back to being written way, way, way before, Christ ever entered the scene. Which is really interesting because, it does prove that a lot of what we see in the Old Testament, like all of what we see in the Old Testament, wasn't rewritten or revised after Christ, right? So that Christ would meet all these, prophecies and everything. Like he actually does fulfill a bunch of prophecies in the Old Testament, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls to prove it. And there's a book of Enoch found amongst those. And one of the issues with the book of Enoch, and the reason why it's not in the Bible, is because the book of Enoch is actually, it proposes that the writer is Enoch himself, without any explanation on how this narrative or how this text came about being written and survived, till today, right? So it's most likely or reasonable to believe that the book of Enoch, and then there's like two others that were found, that these things were kind of like scriptural fan fiction. Someone thought, well, I wonder what's the stuff with Enoch and the stuff with spiritual things. We have no real explanation to verify the integrity of the author of it, because it clearly wasn't Enoch who wrote it. So how did the book come about? And there's no answer for that. So there's just as reasonable to believe that anyone could have written it for any reason and had nothing to do with Enoch himself. So it's there's some reasons to validate it, but it's illogical to assume that it's written by Enoch, if that makes sense. Logic meaning there's only one explanation of things, and so all the books that are actually put in the Bible had to meet a standard of reason and logic for why they were valid or believable, right? And so churches debated this for like 100 years, what books would be canonized in the Bible, and Enoch was left out for that purpose. It's an unreliable author. But anyway, so there's a fun fact about that out there. But anyways, if you ever heard of the book of Enoch, that's kind of the whole thing about it. And this is who it's based on, as his character in the pre-flood days. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff here. Let's see here. Yes. Yeah, you're welcome, this guy. Absolutely. Okay, so I think that kind of covers things with Enoch. But yeah, and there's actually another reference towards the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation. It talks about there are these two prophets who kind of show up out of nowhere, and some suppose that it is Enoch and Elijah, because these are two people who never died, and that God takes them up at that moment, puts them into those events in the book of Revelation in the future, and then that's when they die. So, maybe God is saving up the moment that they die for another time. It's pretty interesting stuff, right? But we won't get too much into all of that. It's a little far down the story for the moment, but really cool stuff nonetheless. Okay, so then one day he disappeared because God just took him. Pretty cool. Let's go ahead and actually real quick. So Lisa, God allowed it to continue to stay in the Bible though, as it is still his word, right? Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mean, all of this stuff that we see, it's like, we could talk about this a little bit. The book of Genesis, where do we get the book of Genesis from? Couldn't have someone just written that? Well, actually, the book of Genesis proposes that Moses is the one who wrote this among several of the first books of the Bible, and that he did this while he was on Mount Sinai speaking directly with God, and that these writings were passed down ever since, and that they had a very, very, very strict way in Jewish society on how they would copy these things down. And because of that reason and logic, because the source is, it's not saying that there was someone during this time writing it down. The source is, well, Moses was talking to God. So, that's a pretty reliable source because God was there, right? So there's a reason and logic to validate the book of Genesis, and there's a reason and logic to validate all the books of the Bible, and that's pretty cool stuff. So, anyways, it would be God's word because of that, and God's inspired word. And there's a lot of evidence for that kind of stuff. So I know that we're here. This is a show for anyone who believes in it, and a show for people who don't believe it and want to understand the story. So for those who may not believe in this, to understand where it comes from as far as being, God's word or God's, inspired word in scripture, doesn't come from just people blindly believing in it. It comes from things like you have all these Old Testament scriptures that prophesy. I think you have over 500 prophecies about the events and details of Jesus Christ's life. And because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that those were written, about 300 years plus before Jesus ever entered the scene. And it would have been completely impossible for anyone to have fulfilled all of those very detailed, prophecies about his life, because many of the things were outside of his control, including where he was born, the events that would happen to him. There's even a very detailed description of exactly how Jesus would be crucified in Psalms. So that's pretty wild stuff. That wouldn't be possible if it was just a text made up by people for just a religious system. All that points to the evidence that it's God's inspired word, right? So, do your research, believe what you want to believe, but there is reason and logic to validate, the books of the Bible. And the book of Enoch is not in here because there isn't a full proof of reason and logic to validate that book. And there's several books that, there's a lot of books out there that didn't get canonized in the Bible for that reason. We know of the Bible doesn't talk about what happened to like the disciples of Jesus. It's a good example of it. It doesn't talk about that, but we kind of know what happened to them because of other books written outside of it, because the disciples of those disciples wrote things, and they wrote about what happened to them. Like we know that Thomas was killed with a spear in India, like someone put a spear through him, and the Bible doesn't tell us that, but other books do. But because it's written by a disciple's disciple, we don't know that author very well. It can't be called Holy Scripture. You know what I mean? It can't be validated at that point because now you don't know if all the details are correct. So anyways, yeah. So that's a difference of what got canonized and what didn't get canonized, and why the Book of Enoch is left out. So anyways, hopefully that answers your question, Lisa. Very good question though. I really like that. So I'm going to continue reading the rest of this. It's going to go very much in a very similar pattern to what we've already read. But one other thing I could point out about this is that when it started giving us details of a specific man in Cain's line, it showed us how evil that man was. When it gives us specific details about a member of Seth's line, it shows us how holy he was. And the picture that's being created here is that you have a line of ungodly people at this time that come from Cain's descendants. And then you have a line of godly people at this time coming from Seth's descendants. And if you know anything about what happens not too far in the future in the story, is that there's a lot of evil over the world and hardly anyone's following God. So how do we get from this to that? Well, the next chapter will really cover those details. So it's going to be fun covering that chapter, but let's go ahead and get through the rest of this part. And let me go ahead and go to this scene. There we go. All right. When Methuselah was 187 years old, he became the father of Lamech. After the birth of Lamech, Methuselah lived another 782 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Methuselah lived 969 years, and then he died. When Lamech was 182 years old, he became the father of a son. Lamech named his son Noah, for he said, "May he bring us relief from our work and the painful labor of farming this ground that the Lord has cursed." After the birth of Noah, Lamech lived another 595 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Lamech lived 777 years, and then he died. By the time Noah was 500 years old, he was the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And there we go. We have the introduction of a pretty big character in the Bible, and that is Noah. So a lot of you are familiar with Noah, pretty big figure, and we'll get into more details of that in chapter 6. But just know he comes from the line of Seth, the line that came, the line of people that were pursuing God, or at least godly people were being noted in that. So it's very interesting that we get these long timelines like this. So Noah actually was old enough to be able to meet and talk with the grandkids of Adam and Eve themselves. So he wouldn't have been old enough, or he wouldn't have been able to see Adam and Eve. Well, we don't know how long Eve lived, probably around the same time as Adam. But Adam would have been passed away by the time Noah was around. But it's very interesting that he could have had conversations with Adam's grandkids. It's a very interesting picture of the world. And we did see in the other in chapter 4, when it talked about Cain's line, it started talking about people who were working with bronze, people who were making instruments and doing all these different things. And when you have all of these people, right? I mean, we have potentially millions or even billions of people on the planet at this time. I mean, just people have just exploded in these first 1,000 years. And, people would have been able to do quite a few things, which is pretty interesting when you start looking at stuff in history. People talk about the Sphinx, how the Sphinx was much older than Egypt itself and has a bunch of water damage on it. Maybe the Nile flooded and managed to damage it that way. Or perhaps it's a relic of a time before there was a mass flood, right? There are plenty of underwater civilizations. They're way out into the ocean. They've been found off of Japan and other places like that, where you find entire pyramids under the ocean. It's like, well, could have been, some geography had changed over time, or we were finding relics of things that were before the events that we're going to read in Noah. So it's not proof or error, of anything like that, but it's definitely worthy of thought. It's very interesting stuff to think about, and makes you think about the world a little bit differently. We have, oil is a very, very good example. We'll talk more about the flood and the details of that later, but just this whole world, there's a flood that buries all these trees and all these people and that sort of thing, all these creatures. Well, that would explain why you have huge pockets of oil in the ground. Oil is just, biomass that has been, rapidly buried, pressurized, and decayed. So that's all it is. But interesting stuff here. So we'll get into more details about those things. I don't want to spoil everything, but we have Noah here, and it says that he's going to be, at least his father predicted, he would be a relief from the the curse that is currently happening in the world, which means that it's not just God's curse of work is difficult, but also the curse of evil is in the world and it's running rampant. So we'll get more details on that next time. With that said, I do want to actually cover one thing. I asked you guys a question last week. That question was, with Abel, who was walking with God, and you have Cain, who wasn't. Well, why did God allow Cain to kill Abel? And so I said I was going to cover at the end of that last episode, and I didn't think of that. So we'll basically answer that as we're going back to Earth on this episode. So stick around for that. We'll talk about a little bit about the character of God as it is portrayed in the Bible, and why God would basically act as a superhero and save Abel, who from being killed by his brother. So anyways, we'll go ahead. We'll go to the front of the ship. That means we're gonna turn this thing around. Well, I mean, no. I want it to be turned around. I want this to be the scene in the background when we go back to the front of the ship. I know we're pointing in the right direction to go back to Earth now. I'm just saying, like, no, Wilson, it doesn't take fuel to turn the ship around. All right, so anyways, well, I'll get Whistle to turn this ship around. It'll take just a few seconds. I'll see you guys then. See, that wasn't so hard. That wasn't so hard. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and head back. Wilson, you're talking to my ear right now. I don't need you to do all that. Let's just set it up here. I've got the panel right here. Let's see. We're going to we get this all. This is very, very precise stuff, and we got to make sure that we actually go back and don't like run into the moon or something. Okay, I think that'll do it. All right, perfect. Let's go ahead and yeah. All right, so we should be heading back now. Now, to answer that question, or at least an answer to that question. So the character of God, it gives human beings, from what we see in chapter 3, it gives them a choice. He gives them the choice to love him or not love them. Now, we covered in detail the whole concept of free will in that chapter. So basically, God has given humans a gift. That's the ability to choose, which enables them to be like him in choosing good and being able to love. So if you're not able to choose, you're not able to love, because very simply, you can't love if you're basically a slave, right? If you're being forced to love someone, you're not actually showing them love. So let's hit this. I should lock us into place. So he's given people free will. Now, God has given people this, which means they have the choice to do, act outside of God's will or outside of God's design, which is called sin. And whenever they do this, if God were to then hover over them and say, you just sinned, or you're about to sin, no, and just steps on the person, that would not be a very just God, I wouldn't say, to say he gives you the gift to choose. And if you don't choose the right choice, then he's going to intervene and prevent you from making that choice, which is what would be required for God to run around like Superman and prevent evil things from happening. So God has done something about evil. We covered that before as well. He sends, Jesus Christ, Son of God, into the world to die for everyone's sins and basically make a way for people to be reconnected to God and reconnect that relationship. So he's done something about it, and that's what he's done. But he is not necessarily, if he were to go out of his way to just intervene, like in this situation with Cain, he's stealing something from Cain that he gave to him and all humanity as a gift. And it's very interesting that God respects us so much that he will even allow people to do things that he doesn't want them to do. Now, from God's perspective, it's not like Abel stopped existing. When he died, he just was with God. So from his perspective, it's a little bit different from our perspective on Earth, where when someone dies, they're seemingly gone, right? And that's part of the tragedy of that. We won't see them until the next life. But God is immediately with God, so it's a very different perspective. It's one of the reasons why the Bible say God's ways are different than our ways, because he not only stands outside of our physical reality, he stands outside of time itself, because God created time, so he stands outside of it. So he sees the beginning, the end, the whole thing. So yeah, he has a very different perspective on those things. Death is more just a transition to the next phase for him. And so between those two things, I will say this: God does put a limit to how much evil and how far evil will go. And that actually goes to, when we'll cover this in a future chapter, these long lifespans. The Bible gives a reason for why these long lifespans don't keep happening, and that's because God limits the age of human beings to about 120 years, and that's so that to prevent people from doing so much evil. Right. And so God's going to limit the lifespan of people to prevent how much evil they can do. And then we also, you can look throughout history. very evil people, at some point in time, that evil catches up with them. Some people who observe this call this karma or whatever else, but God puts a limit on how much evil he's going to let someone get away with. So no one really gets away with it, so to speak, in the end. Cain didn't get away with it. We'll point at some low-hanging fruit that we can all agree on. Hitler didn't get away with it. These evil people, there's a limit. It catches up with them. And sometimes it doesn't seem like it's going to, but that's part of the cry of looking to God for justice, and part of the promise in things like the Book of Revelation, or even in the prophets, that sort of thing, that God will conquer evil, he will punish evil, and it won't get away with, what it tries to get away with. So anyways, yes, he allowed Abel to be killed, and in the grand scheme of things, Cain didn't accomplish that much by doing that, and Abel's just right there with God. So it's kind of like, actually not that bad of a deal for Abel. So anyways, that's kind of my brief explanation of that. Let's see here. Some comments here. Free will allows us to have actual relationship with God, and that is pretty special. That is 100% true. You said it way better than I could have said it. Yes, we could not have an actual relationship with God without free will. And that's why it's necessary. This guy, God sounds like a gentleman. Yes, you know what? I think it was Billy Graham, or I think one of Billy Graham's kids. They said that, but basically what you're saying, God is a gentleman. He will not force himself on you, right? He will not force himself into your life to fix your problems or anything like that. If you push God to the side, step aside. And Cain pushed God to the side, and Cain lost quite a bit in that. He had a passion in life, and he's going to live for hundreds of years, and he cannot exercise that passion anymore. Instead, probably had to take care of the animals that his brother was taking care of, and that's gonna be a harsh reminder of what you did for the rest of your life. So anyways, and yet still God showed him love, despite the fact that he was, did a horrible thing, which is also kind of gives us all hope that just because you do something terrible or sin or anything like that doesn't mean that God doesn't love you. It doesn't mean that God hates you or is out to get you. So yeah, still loves you, and still want to work with you, so long as you're willing to humble yourself and turn from those things, which is basically the concept of repentance. So anyways, I think we're good there. Let's see here. Liz, hi. I love this. It's definitely helping me learn and understand the Bible more. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining. So yeah, that's the whole purpose of this, right? Whether, the Bible that we cover on Wednesday nights, or when we can get those Friday shows up about once a month. We're going to get one up here, hopefully this next Friday, and we cover some different stories. All it's about understanding these stories and giving back to people what belongs to all of us, because the Bible stories and all these stories are your stories, and you deserve to know them. You deserve to understand them. And whether you agree with them or disagree with them, I think understanding them is important. So never thought I could get so much out of a chapter of genealogy. Yeah, it's there's a lot more beneath some of these things. And I'm sure we'll get to some chapters where, I'm not sure how we're going to tackle the Book of Numbers. Yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But until then, yeah, it's some good stuff. When they throw in a little fact like someone walked with God and then just, didn't die and just got taken up, it's kind of cool. So anyways, with that, I appreciate you guys joining. Be sure to hit that like, hit that subscribe, and share the video. I have some short videos that I downloaded. It makes it easier that if you want to tell someone about the channel, you want to give them a glimpse of it. There's a few of them that are from the Friday show, and I also have one of them from the Wednesday show. And then you can kind of share that with them, let them know about the channel, and have them check it out. This is, we're trying to get all humans on board here. Every human the show is for them. And yeah, so we'll eventually get a humble 1 billion people subscribed to this. Get the world together around the campfire, so to speak. Have some shared stories together. That way we don't feel like we're so different from one another, because we aren't. Let's see here. One number at a time. Yes, there you go. Yes, Dan, that is exactly how we'll probably have to get through it. One number at a time. Same way you eat an elephant, right? Let's see here. LOL, one number at a time. Yep. And bye, Wilson. Love you. Of course, of course. So Wilson, he's appreciating over there. If he could blush, I'm sure he would be blushing right now. So, okay. Well, with that, we'll go ahead, hit the outro, and yeah, I will see you guys next time.
I know the air I'm breathing, it's no good for my lungs. I do this every season, I hate when summer comes. I fall into a trap that I made by myself, oh, and I always do.
Wilson, you know that calling that the ship's crew, the ship being the ship's crew is problematic. You know that, right? I'm just saying, Not saying we can't acknowledge the ship. I'm just saying it's kind of weird to say the ship is part of the crew.
I'm so sorry, but I'm not able to slow down now. And I'm so sorry, but I'm not able to slow down now. And I'm so sorry, but I'm not able to slow down now. I'm always self-destructive. I take a hit, I love it. Can you give me a second? I'm slow, got blurry vision.
Yes, special thanks to everyone who joined the live stream. Thank you guys so much. And all the artists listed in the description, please be sure to check them out. And to every brave subscriber, thank you. You keep us flying. We'll see you next time.
I'm so sorry, but I'm not able to slow down. I feel unable and so unworthy. My heart feels heavy, I've lost already. And I'm so sorry, but I'm not able to slow down now. Please help me see the things that I am. I don't understand. I'm doing the best that I can right now, but it's never enough. I'm not even